I'll just put this on. I've got a pimple on my nose. Right. Okay, I just want to make this video today. It's just a quick video. Let me see if that's come up there. Is it? Are we there? Don't know if we're there. Probably no one come on because I know that it's very late in the night. So, but I'm going to make this video today. Somebody's been talking to me all day, so now it's hard for me to get it done. But let's see if we can. Okay, there you go. All right. So this this video that I just posted up. Let's turn that off. Right, and I'll make that small. Right, there you go. All right, so this I'm just posted up a series of letters from Crown de Dieu. So these letters are not my letters, but they take quite a bit of reading. But if you're the all right, someone's in here now. Okay, so if hopefully someone can see me. If anyone's in there, you can say hi, Kat, and I see you. Okay, so what are our last videos now? Some of you are new, but some of you are old, and they know my videos. And we did do a series of around about 6 or 7 videos. It was called the Marsden series, where we went back to the time of, we went all the way back to 1808, when Marsden first came to New Zealand and started picking up, well, he didn't come, but he sent his missionaries, started picking up New Zealand Maori and taking them over to live with him in Australia. And then they took the New Zealand Maori over to England, where Samuel Lee translated the Maori language into a language. And then all of these evil people proceeded to come back. Now, these people were not, in the end, they were discovered to be not part. They were like working undercover within the Church Missionary Society, but they weren't, in fact, Church Missionary Society believers. They had changed their belief. They were almost like maybe you might call them rogue missionaries, and their plans were not to get the natives to become civilized and Christianized. Their plan was to take over the entire country and make it belonging to them. And so they ended up getting Arawira, I can't pronounce his name, who was molested by William Yates and a few others. And eventually it all came to a head when it was discovered that William Yates had molested more than 400, that they know of New Zealand Maori boys and girls. And we also know, I'm just going to say it because, you've got to tell the truth. The Catholics were also giving gifts to the New Zealand Maori in return for some lovely favours that they might be collecting. But anyway, we managed to get through, and then we went through the years of, they got this whakaputanga written, and they got this flag from the king. And actually what it had turned out was that they were going to be the owners of New Zealand, not the New Zealand Maori. They had basically tricked these few Maori into signing it. And then from the years of 1836 up until 1840, not only several other companies, what had happened was several other companies wanted to take the lands. They wanted a piece of the action, and they were very annoyed with the missionaries for hogging all the action and not agreeing to let anybody speak with the Maori, not agreeing to let anybody be friends with the Maori, and all of this kind of thing. They were called Aboriginals back then anyway. Well, anyway, a man called John Dunmore Lang and with the New Zealand company, because they wanted to buy land and they were not able to but the missionaries kept stopping them in Marsden. So the New Zealand company set about conducting a whole, something like 4 years of investigations of what was going on in New Zealand and why the country was in such disarray and why the chiefs were on the streets of New Zealand, selling themselves and selling their daughters, and landless and penniless, and just starving. People were starving, including many settlers that had been sold land deeds went to New Zealand, not realising that there was no government, and they ended up starving as well. So the whole country was just in terrible disarray. Now, you have to go back and watch those videos. I'm not going to be talking about that now, but a man called John Dunmore Lang, they were trying to figure out the slave Maoris. A lot of the New Zealand Maori had become slaves, and they were taken from their lands, and they were sold to missionaries as slaves to work on the farms, and they had lost all their lands. Now, you can't go blaming all the Anglo people for this. Most of the Anglo people were very nice, but it was this small mafiosa group that were determined to own the entire country. So don't go blaming all of the Anglo people. Most of them were just innocent people that had been sold dubious land deeds and been lied to that the country had a government. A Poyais government is what they call it, Poyais. Go and look it up yourself. So there was a Poyais government, and the poor innocent people had bought land deeds thinking that there was a government, and when they arrived in New Zealand, the New Zealand Maori said, no, you're not having that, and cut their heads off, and killed thousands of Anglo people, children, women, everybody just was killed and slaughtered. So they wanted to figure out a way out of this whakaputanga. John Dunmore Lang wrote letters, and he outlined a way that Her Majesty could enter New Zealand through her right of preemption because of the discovery of Norfolk Island. Now, I want you to keep Norfolk Island in your mind because it's going to come up in a minute. So I really want you to, this Norfolk Island was in the meridian of New Zealand. And since Norfolk Island was discovered by the British, it was entirely a British country almost, so to speak. And it belonged entirely to them because it was uninhabited when they found it. But because it was on the meridian of New Zealand, that gave the Majesty the first right of preemption, which meant that the New Zealand Maori were not allowed to sell their land to anyone without first giving the Majesty the right of preemption to buy it. And then if the Majesty turned it down, then the other people could have bought it. So this was what was going on at that time. So what it was discovered is that the Majesty said, well, we're not going to send all our people and all our resources, our schools, our laws, all of that. We're not going to send all that there unless you give all the power of governance to us. Now, what had happened was, here's the truth of it. Almost all of the lands had been sold to these missionaries. They had bought up ports and bays and harbours and towns. They had bought up the whole freaking lot. There was nothing left. The chiefs owned nothing. And so when the whakaputanga was signed, it made those land deeds legal. Pre-whakaputanga, all land deeds were not legal. But as soon as they announced that they had a government, land deeds then became legal. And the signees of the whakaputanga, which was Clark and Clendon and Williams, and Yates was in there somewhere, and Busby was in there somewhere, and Marsden was in there somewhere. So as soon as that whakaputanga was signed, all their land deeds became legal in the eyes of the international law and community. And so that's just the way it is. So the Queen said, right, I'm going to come in and I'm going to take the whole freaking lot back, all of it. I'm going to put the whole freaking lot into a land court, and everybody has to come and prove their case. And so then she said, but I'm only going to do that if the New Zealand Maori cede the sovereignty of governance, not the land, but the governance to Her Majesty and Her Majesty's laws. Now, they had to do that, or she would not have been allowed to come, as you will see in a minute. Now, what had happened was, now here I'm going to get to this court case where I've posted these 14 letters and I'm going to do one video for each day of the court case. So we're on the first day. Well, actually, the first day is missing because apparently the first day was Busby. But we're on this day of Tuesday, the 30th of June, 1840. Now, what had happened is the missionaries that had bought all of these lands, including Busby, including Clark, including Williams, Marsden, they all took the British Empire to court, and they said they already had an established government, and they had the whakaputanga, and we bought all these lands under that, and so you had no right to walk in and take all of the land and put it into a court case. So this was the battle that they were having. And the second person was actually a man called Charles Wentworth. So I'm just going to read a little bit from my notes here to tell you what happened on the first day of court. I don't know what happened to Busby because he was supposed to be the first day of court. But anyway, this court case was the 1840, the claims to grants of land by the New Zealand Bill of Opposition. At that time, it actually wasn't called the Treaty of Waitangi. It was called a New Zealand Bill. That since the whakaputanga had been signed for 5 years, or around about 4 years, 4 to 5 years, there were court cases going on in both England and in Australia to get the New Zealand Maori out of this whakaputanga that they had been duped into signing, is what had happened. And now where did I get a little bit lost there? So this guy, Charles Wentworth, now here's the strange thing. He was born on Norfolk Island to a very, very extremely wealthy lord from England and one of the ship slaves, white slaves. And then he was born, Wentworth. I hope everybody can hear me. Is it got good sound there? Whakaputanga, good night. Whatever. We're doing the court case now. So this is the court case that was going on. So Charles Wentworth, all right, he was actually born on Norfolk Island. And then his father was a very, very wealthy landowner from England. So I'm not going to go into that because that's kind of another kind of a story. But anyway, I hope you can all hear me. But anyway, in the first case, this is what the guts of the case was about. Said that the case was using the Blackstone Law, Volume 1, Chapter 7, page 270. And this was the first day of hearings on the 30th day of June, 1840, which was like 5 months. We've got February, March, April, May, June. So 4 months after the treaty was signed, this court case went ahead. For the proclamation to be binding, it must be founded on an old law. And so that was what they were saying is that for the Treaty of Waitangi to be binding, it had to be founded on old laws that were already established. And what they're fighting about here is that there was no old law established to be in the same way that the treaty had been formulated. That's the best way I can explain it. So they're going to explain what the old laws were and why the Treaty of Waitangi was illegal in their mind. So the question was, did the native Aboriginals of New Zealand have the right to sell their own land? And that they agreed to sell only to British subjects, and this was honouring the right of preemption. So what they were saying is, as long as the New Zealand Maori only sold to British subjects, then those sales would be legal as by the right of preemption from Norfolk Island. So it's very interesting that this Wentworth guy turned up. He had bought thousands of acres of New Zealand land and thousands of acres of Australian land and thousands of acres of British land through his father and grandfather, who had evaded the English tribes 200 years ago in the 1600s. So this is like a family thing. So he turns up and he's the one that is fighting this. So he said that the right of preemption was still honoured as long as the sales were only to British people. He wanted Hobson to show the old law that the treaty was based on, or the law of nations law that the treaty was based on, or the law of America. So he wanted Hobson to show what was the foundation of this law of this treaty that the British Empire had made with the New Zealand Maori. And what he started talking about was the American Indians. And the American Indians, where there was a new law that was made that individuals could not buy land. So in America, they had made this new law that the individual people were no longer allowed to purchase any land from the American Indians. And if they wanted to purchase land from the American Indians, then they had to go through a government process first. And then if that was approved and it was seen as being fair, then the sale would be allowed to go through. But if it was not approved. But on this occasion with the American Indians, all the previous purchasers were honoured and did not interfere with man's rights and possessions. Now, under the 1688 Bill of Rights, there are laws, and in the law of nations, that you can't interfere, forfeiture of persons and forfeiture of property, that they can't take property from any person that has acquired it by legal and lawful means. And so, and if they did, that would be interfering with the rights of man. So this was like the highest natural law. And in the case of America, they started it fresh. They said, right, all those lands that were already sold, that's done and dusted, and there's nothing we can do about that. But any more lands that you want to buy, you're going to have to go through the correct processes. And Wentworth's argument was that all of his lands and Busby's lands and Clark's lands and Williams' lands and all the people that were signed up to that whakaputanga, all their land sales, which included 50 Maori so-called chiefs, because they had been given all of their parcels of land within the deal. But because these rogue missionary people knew that as soon as it got into the Maori lands, eventually they would own it anyway, because the Maoris didn't know. Anyway, it's another story. So you had these missionaries, these rogue missionaries, plus these Maori leaders that had been given lands. And so Wentworth was saying, we want all of those to be out of the Treaty of Waitangi. We don't want them to be under any investigation, is what he's saying. And he said, but from now on, starting from 1840, any more land sales would have to go through the court and the correct process as well. Well, that was a waste of time, wasn't it? Because all the lands had already been freaking sold, hadn't they? So, of course, he wouldn't want an investigation, would he? Cheeky bugger. So he said, if the Indians have the right to sell the lands, then so did the New Zealand Maori, because they had the whakaputanga and they were a government, so they could sell it. And he said the Crown had divested its power basically by giving the flag. Now, I'm just going to say a little bit on this flag, because you know me and my flags, but I'll say a little bit on this flag. When the British king was tricked, and I will say tricked, into giving the flag for the ships, he did not realise that when he gave them the flag, that they were going to write this whakaputanga and claim governments and then buy up all the lands. So basically, they didn't realise that they were handing over the sovereignty and the dependency from Australia. So when he sent that flag, basically all protections to New Zealand were gone. And this is when all these sneaky buggers moved in. Yeah, so it was quite sneaky. So the king had lost his power when he gave the flag, and then they got the whakaputanga. So what he said is that the Indians, the American Indians, ceded the soil before the declaration was made. But the Crown made the declaration before the soil was ceded and before knowing if it would ever be ceded. So just to explain that, everybody has to understand that some of the people on my channel are really struggling to understand, and I'm going slowly for them. So for you understand, that's just too bad, because there are some people that don't, and so they need it to be explained a little bit more clearly, and so that's what I intend to do. So according to my gumboot lawyer, and of course I'm not a lawyer. Who would want to be? Right, so the Indians had already ceded the soil to the government, and then the Declaration of Independence was written. But the case was different for the New Zealand Maori. The declaration was written, and it was only going to come into force if the New Zealand Maori ceded to it. So he saw that as being a problem. And Wentworth quoted a man called Vattel in law that until the council passed a restrictive law, the natives had the right to sell all lands in whatever quantity that they pleased, and the council had no right to examine the title. So here is the crux of it. He's saying that they can set up the courts because the Maori have already ceded, the Maori have signed the treaty, they've ceded, but previous to that ceding, the land belonged to them and they had the right to sell it. And what Wentworth is saying is that the current councils have no right to investigate those land sales. Well, we all know why he doesn't want to be investigated, don't we? He said all the council could do was establish a court that the natives could appeal to. He said he does not object to such, but he objects to the sweep to take all of the land. So the Queen said, I'm going to take the whole freaking lot, and the entire country is going to go into, the entire lands of the country is going to go into the court. Everyone will come to prove their claim, and there'll be investigations on each and every claim. And he says he's opposed to that, but he's not opposed to any New Zealand Maori that have a grievance to going to a court and expressing what their grievance is. So I don't know what that means to him. The British subjects, what he said, so the battle was, here's the battle, was if the Crown had the right to take all the lands after the treaty, or only if the Crown had the right to take all the lands that were purchased before the treaty, or if they only had the right to take the lands that were left after the treaty was signed. So that was his fight. All right, we're on the last page now. He said according to the international law, and okay, let me just go. Whether the rights according to it. So according to the international laws, here's what it said. Individuals landing in an uninhabited country or land had the right to establish a government and an empire. So Norfolk Island was uninhabited, so the British had the right to establish their empire there. But if it was inhabited, those same people could also do so with consent of the natives. and that would be called the strongest argument in law. So, meaning that he and his missionary friends had asked the natives for permission to form their government and form their empire in New Zealand, and the natives had said yes, and the natives had the right to do that because they had written this whakaputanga, is what they had said. So, therefore, because he had the permission of the natives, that's what he had the right to do. And he's given that I told you that they have to have a previous law to show their basis. And he said that he's quoted from England. Now, this is, I'm almost finished, so I hope you're staying. This is where you're going to see that the Anglo people of England and the people of Scotland and the people of Ireland, they were all tribal too. And all of their lands were invaded also. And all of their lands actually were, in fact, stolen from them. And they were all put into perpetual slavery forever. All right? Now, in 1620, in 1620, the people of England had no royal charter and they had no constitution. And so it was decided that all of the invading powers, since those idiots had no constitution, that the invading powers had the right to take over their land. So this is where you're going to see that us Anglo people and us New Zealand Maori people were in exactly the same boat. The only difference is, and the Germanic people who were the first, by the way, to lose all their land. And so this process had happened to all the Anglo people 200 years before it ever happened to the Aboriginals and the Maoris. It all happened to us first. And so our people rose up. And anyway, that's another story, but I'm not going to talk about that. So he said that this happened in England. They had no royal charter. And there was a place called Connecticut in England, and the missionaries, those missionaries again, went there in 1636, and they made a consent with the natives of that town that they wanted to be separated from the Church of England, and they wanted to establish their own town under the natural law. Is the natural law. And they said they didn't want to be under the church and they didn't want to be under the kings, and they wanted to be their own. But as soon as they made that deal with the natives, what they did was that the only people that could own land were people that belonged to the church, and the only people that could vote were people that belonged to the church. So that's what they did in 1636 in England. Two towns there in 1620. So basically, that is the supporter that in 1620, first, a whole lot of people invaded England, and because they didn't have a royal charter or any laws, those people had just took it over and had the right to make an empire there. And then this church group then came along to a place called Connecticut, and they made deals separately with the natives and said to those natives, right, we're going to make this area only belonging to you, separated from England, and we want your agreement that we can build our religious empire here. And the natives agreed to that. And so under that, they were permitted to own that town. And so Wentworth is saying that this is the same situation with the New Zealand Maori, that the missionaries came, they made an agreement with the individual chiefs that they could set up the government over New Zealand as by their churches. And then the British Crown, as you know, in 1840 has come in and said, no, we're making the whakaputanga void, we're making the flag void, we're making all of that void, and all the lands are going into this court. So that's where I'm leaving off. You'll have to wait for day two of the court case. See you later.